director of the Biscayne Community Foundation, and we're very lucky tonight to have Dr. Andrew Baker. He's associate professor at the University of Miami, and he's going to be speaking to us tonight about coral reefs and climate change. It's a topic that is not well known, I don't think, by this community, but very important, and how a slight degree change can change everything, and the greater impact on our ecosystem. Before Andrew comes up, I'd also like to point out that he's one of the founders of Citizen Scientists. It was Andrew and Dr. Diego Lerman's brainchild, so we are lucky that all of this is available to the residents of Key Biscayne because of Dr. Baker. So I'd like to thank him. And without further ado, we will begin.
Melissa's not doing herself justice, because I have to say, on behalf of Diego and myself, that there's no way that we would have been able to get this off the ground without the help of the Key Biscayne Community Foundation. Is this microphone working okay? Oh, yeah. Yeah? I sort of feel like I'm in a stadium. I should sing the national anthem or ask everybody to stand up. So before I get started, this is sort of more of a conversation, really, and I'm going to talk a little bit about coral reef ecosystems and give you sort of an introduction to coral reefs, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the threats that coral reefs face, and in particular the threat of climate change and the research that we're doing at RSMAS, the Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science, just across the causeway, or the Bear Cut Bridge, I should say, on Virginia Key. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the citizen science project that we have going to help engage interested community members, citizens like yourselves, in the process of data collection that will actually help scientists monitor the decline and hopefully the recovery of coral reef and other coastal ecosystems around the Key. You know, you all live on an island paradise, and much of that paradise is based on the vicinity of healthy coastal and marine habitats. And it's really our goal to use or leverage a resource that you have, which is the Rosenstiel School, to help protect those environments and to sort of strengthen the relationship between the village and the Rosenstiel School. Before I get started, just a few announcements. Some of you might have one of these sheets. This actually outlines all of the talks, seminars this sort of semester through the Citizen Science project. And you can see that tonight we're actually kicking off the fall seminar series with my talk. And Dr. Diego Lerman, who's also a professor at RSMAS, is going to be sort of closing it out on December the 5th, although there is one more talk after that from Lisa Krimsky, who's also at RSMAS. But between here and then, you can see there's quite a rich agenda of stuff for you to do. And not all of it is talks. I'd like to draw your attention to, it says Saturday, October TBA, Youth Fishing Clinic. That's actually being now set for November the 3rd. It's a Sunday, November the 3rd. And it's a great opportunity if you have kids, kids, grandkids who are interested in learning both the practice of fishing and the idea of sustainable fishing, how, which fish you should be fishing, how to safely remove them from the hook, how to return them to the water. It's a great, fun day out, morning out for the whole family. All the equipment is provided, and there's all kinds of informational booths there about the fish and about the habitats around the Key. So I'd highly encourage you to do that. It's the second one that we've run on the Key. We ran one in, I want to say March, April, and it was sold out. I say sold out, there is no cost, but it was fully booked within a few days of opening. So I'd encourage you, if you are interested, to RSVP and get your name on that list. And I think that's all I want to say. One more item. One of the Citizen Science Project interns, and I have two of them sitting next to me here, Audra and Ali. Audra will make a short announcement when I'm done, letting you guys know about the first workshop in the series, which is sort of an educational workshop that will help you, if you want to become engaged in the Citizen Science Project, learn about the kinds of data collection you might be taking. And I think she's going to start the first one off on mangroves. Yeah, so it'll be the first community workshop will be on mangroves, teaching you how to identify different mangrove species and how to collect the various data that we're interested in. She's not going to do that tonight. She's just going to tell you about when it's going to be, hopefully, after we finish. Any questions? Yes?
Just wanted to know about the beach cleanup and the World Water Monitoring Day and things. Where will we get more information about that? Like what time and where?
Well, I think the best place I can direct you to is probably the website, first of all. Right, so I should also mention Bob Molinari, the guy here in the blue shirt, wave your hand, is the source of information for the project. But you know, if you can't get hold of Bob or Ali or Audra or myself or Melissa, the website is the best place to go if you want to find, and that's keyscience.org, which is there. It's a great website, by the way. And as we get more information and data, it'll all go up on the website so you can actually see the data that you've collected visualized in a geographic information system. So, any other questions? Okay, so I'll get started. If any of you ever have a problem hearing me because of this moving around, just wave your hand and I'll remember to keep it close to my mouth. So I'm going to talk about coral reef ecosystems and give you a brief introduction and then also mention the threats that coral reefs face. But because my children are in the audience, all three of them, and I never get to talk about the motivations for my research, I thought I would slip this in, which is that my first experience of coral reefs, and it wasn't really a physical experience, but my first intellectual experience was actually reading books, and these two books in particular, which were written by an American author who wrote them, I want to say in his 80s. They came out in the 50s, and they were very popular in Britain. I'm British, when I was growing up as a kid there. And these were the two that I remember most, which involved these two young guys, Hal and Roger, who were brothers, aged 13 and 19, who would be sent by their father, who was an animal wildlife collector based in Long Island, and he would send them off on cruises and expeditions around the world to the Amazon, to the South Seas, to collect wildlife for their father, who would then sell them to the Bronx Zoo, to the New York Zoological Society. And I thought this was an amazing adventure. This is exactly what I wanted to do. And so I was delighted when, in fact, my first job out of graduate school after getting my PhD, which was actually here at the University of Miami, was working for the New York Zoological Society in New York. So I felt that I sort of came full circle. So kids, this was my motivation for what I do now, reading books. Yeah, they're a great series of books. So coral reefs we all know as, or perhaps we don't all know, but you know, they're often referred to as the rainforests of the sea. And you can sort of see why when you see photos like this, which are not from Florida. This is actually the Great Barrier Reef. But corals form these amazing underwater structures that look like, you know, cathedrals or meadows or buildings. And they're formed by the calcification, the process of skeleton building of tiny polyps, almost sometimes microscopic polyps. And these polyps together build structures that you can see from space. The Great Barrier Reef is 2,000 miles long, several tens of miles wide, and in some parts of the ocean, coral reefs can actually be almost a mile thick in terms of the actual buildup of coral skeletons one on top of one another. So they're pretty amazing organisms, and that's one of the things that motivated me to study them scientifically. And the other reason why they're often called the rainforests of the sea is just like rainforests, which everybody understands to be very biodiverse, to be full of species, many of which we've not described, we haven't discovered yet, and yet we're losing them through the clear-cutting of forests and so on. Coral reefs are very much the same. They're the underwater equivalent of rainforests because many of life's or experiments in survival on this planet are found only on coral reefs, or coral reefs are critical for their overall survival. In fact, biologists like to classify life on this planet, and we divide them into groups called phyla, sort of groups of closely related life forms. And of the 34 or so phyla that are found on planet Earth, fully 30 of those different experiments in life are found on coral reefs. So they're incredibly diverse, and compare that to just 12 animal phyla found on all terrestrial ecosystems combined. So if you take all of the landmass and look at all of the different types of life that comes to 12 different groups, well, we've got 30 just on coral reefs. So in some measures, coral reefs are actually more biodiverse than even rainforests. In fact, some of you may know that rainforests are very biodiverse, mainly for one particular group of organisms that dominate diversity in rainforests. Anybody know what they are? Insects. And a particular kind of insect? Beetles. So something like 50 to 70% of all the described species of insect in, for example, the Amazon are beetles. And in fact, that prompted Ernst Haeckel, who was a great champion of Darwinism in the 19th century, to comment that we don't know if God exists, but if he does, he has an inordinate love of beetles. So what are coral reefs worth? What's the point of studying them? And just beyond their sheer beauty and their biodiversity that I've mentioned, which for me are good enough, but I realize that I have to justify things in other ways, and they're actually very easy to justify. Coral reefs provide us with what we call ecosystem goods and services, things that they do for us as a human society that are really invaluable. Things like coastline protection from storms and tsunamis and storm surge, important in a place like Key Biscayne. Coastline protection I've mentioned, and tourism, recreation, fishing industries, animal protein for many dependent coastal communities, and of course pharmaceuticals. They're sort of the planet's pharmaceutical repository, and because there's so much biodiversity on these in these underwater rainforests, there have been many experiments biochemically in how to solve the problems that life challenges us with. And so biologists and biotechnicians are increasingly interested in coral reefs as places where you can get drugs from the sea. You can essentially use hundreds of millions of years of evolution to help you find out solutions to problems that face us, such as cancer or Alzheimer's. And just to put some numbers on those, in South Florida alone, coral reefs provide over 61,000 jobs. Very conservatively, this is just direct inputs to the economy, and provide us with about $5.7 billion a year, and provide habitat for about 30% of our fisheries. So we tend to think of coral reefs as a sort of a luxury ecosystem, especially since we live, in an island paradise in a developed nation that's relatively rich and powerful. But in fact, in other parts of the world, coral reefs are not seen as luxury ecosystems at all. They're seen as the critical underpinnings of the local economies. And I should mention here that coral reefs provide us with all of these things, $375 billion each year, even though they cover less than 0.1% of the world's surface area. So they're very scarce, and yet in those scarce small areas are packed all of these goods and services that we can utilize, as well as all the biodiversity that we value. 500 million people live within 100 kilometers of a coral reef. That would include everybody here. And in developing countries, they can contribute up to 1/4 of the total fish catch and provide food to an estimated 1 billion people in Asia alone. In fact, in Asia, many people depend on coral reefs as the principal source of their animal protein. And as I've mentioned, they provide a natural, self-building, self-repairing breakwater against wave and storm damage. All of these things we sort of take for granted. We just assume that nature will go on as normal, producing or providing us with these goods and services, and yet we don't really invest in maintaining them, and that's sort of a theme I guess I'll come back to. And as I've mentioned, these ecosystems really constitute the economic base and the prospects for hope and survival, sustainable development for many island nations worldwide, particularly in Southeast Asia and areas of the Pacific, on low-lying islands and atolls where literally the ground itself is made by a coral reef. So what are the problems that coral reefs face? Well, many of you, I think, are probably aware that coral reefs have been declining fairly precipitously over the last generation or so, 30 to 40 years. And this is just a chart that was published a few years ago now that showed the results of hundreds, if not actually thousands, of surveys of coral reefs in the Caribbean, measuring the amount of coral that occupied the bottom of the ocean where coral reefs are found. And you can see that this plot over time shows that over about 25 years, the amount of coral actually on these reefs declined from somewhere about 50% down to less than 10%. So that's an 80% decline in relative terms. And in fact, by some measures, we're losing coral reefs about 4 times faster than we're losing the world's tropical rainforests. And this is sort of out of sight, out of mind. We're not an aquatic species. We don't really experience these things firsthand, at least not unless we're scuba divers. And we can't really visualize them from space, right? People are used to seeing space images, satellite images of burning rainforests and getting an idea of what's been lost. We just don't have that information for coral reefs, or that visualization for coral reefs. And just recently, last year, some more bad news from the Great Barrier Reef, which many people had used as a great example of reefs that can still be resilient and sort of maintain it. And unfortunately, this showed that even on the Great Barrier Reef, there's been significant declines on coral cover. There's some good news, which is that even though on the Great Barrier Reef as a whole, coral cover is going down, in fact, it's not being affected in the northern Great Barrier Reef, and that most of those declines are driven by the southern Great Barrier Reef. And it just so happens that the southern Great Barrier Reef is where the main cities are, Brisbane, Gladstone, those parts of Queensland. So, you know, there's a good case that the further away coral reefs are from us, the better they do. So it's, you know, it's really human impacts. Now, why did I get interested in these declines? Well, I got interested from the coral perspective. I got interested in corals mainly because they're beautiful to look at, and I sort of found them fascinating. And the fact, as I mentioned, that these can build these underwater ecosystems and these huge structures. But it was, in particular, it was the symbiosis that corals form or establish with tiny single-celled algae, plants, if you like, that photosynthesize and use sunlight energy to make food, and they pass that to the coral. One thing I haven't mentioned is, perhaps you guys know, but corals are animals, and the skeleton of the coral is what I'm holding here. This is just the skeleton left over when the coral dies, and the coral itself is just a very thin veneer of tissue on top of this coral skeleton. So the coral animal is just really very small, and yet it just lays down a skeleton that grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And in fact, a coral skeleton can grow to be the size of this room. In fact, some of the largest corals in the world are bigger than this room, and they can be thousands of years old. So I'm just going to pass these around so that you guys can see what they're like. Most of these are Caribbean species, but not all of them. This is not a Caribbean species, for example. So some of them are from the Pacific. There's two branches here of, this is an endangered coral, which I'll talk about later. This is the Caribbean staghorn coral, Acropora cervicornis. This was placed on the endangered species list in 2006. And this shows you just how threatened corals are, that they've actually made it to the endangered species list. And just pass them around random directions, it's fine. So you can see that corals come in all variety of shapes and sizes, and this is one of my personal favorites, which is a mushroom coral. This comes from the Indo-Pacific, and you can see why it's called a mushroom coral. This is actually a solitary coral, a coral that just has one great big polyp in the middle, and then this whole skeleton is just a single polyp, so it's kind of interesting. But as I said, the reason why I got interested in corals to start with is that they're symbioses. Even though they're animals, they form associations or partnerships with tiny algae that live inside their cells. And there are so many of these algae, up to 1 million or 2 million for every square centimeter of the coral, that actually corals depend on these algae for their survival. It's a bit like you or I covering ourselves with tiny solar cells, solar panels, and using the energy that we got from these solar panels to eat and to run our lives, and use that for energy instead of actually going to eat. And so this partnership is really critical for understanding why coral reef ecosystems have been so successful in colonizing the parts of the world's oceans that are actually very, very low in nutrients. We often associate coral reefs with crystal clear waters, and the reason why the waters are crystal clear is they're very low in nutrients. There's nothing growing in them. In fact, coral reefs grow in the marine equivalent of a desert. There's extremely low nutrients, and corals are able to survive in this area because they very efficiently recycle nutrients between the coral animal and the tiny algal cells that photosynthesize, and so they shuttle nutrients backwards and forwards in a very efficient recycling program. So this symbiosis between corals and algae, and these algae are sometimes called zooxanthellae, is very critical to coral survival. Here's a sort of a diagram showing a magnified view of a coral polyp, and this is a magnified view of the tentacle of the coral polyp, and you can see that it's loaded with these yellow-brown algae that act as I said, as solar panels that provide the coral with food. And these solar panels are found in many, many different reef organisms. In fact, you could argue that these algae, these zooxanthellae, are pretty ubiquitous members of coral reef ecosystems. In fact, it's hard to imagine that you could even have coral reefs without these algae, because they're so critical to the energy and the energy budgets of these animals. So they're found all over coral reefs, and it was this symbiosis that really fascinated me. And I was lucky enough as a graduate student to get into this field at a time when it was really developing very quickly, because the application of modern day DNA methods, genetic methods, allowed us to look at these different algae and figure out whether they were, how genetically related they were to one another. And we began to discover that the algae inside all of these different corals were in fact very different. Until we looked and sort of ran genetic tests on them, we assumed that they were all the same. And we assumed they were the same because when you look at them under a microscope, they all look very similar. They're just little round yellow-brown algae. When you look at their DNA, in fact, they're incredibly different from one another. They're as different from each other as you and I might be different from horses or goats or pigs or cattle or monkeys or anything else, any other mammal. So there's a huge amount of diversity in them. So you can think about this coral hosting algae that are the equivalent of pigs, and this coral hosting algae that are the equivalent of cats. And a pig and a cat, or a pig and an elephant, or an elephant and a mouse are all very different. And we began to realize that these algae do very different things for their coral hosts. Even though they don't vary in size like a mouse and an elephant, under their skins they're genetically very different and physiologically very different. And the reason why these algae are so important, I mentioned that they contribute to the energy budgets, but they're also so important because they are key to understanding why corals are so threatened from the point of view of climate change. Now, it turns out that this partnership between corals and its algae is very susceptible to changes in environmental conditions, and in particular to changes in temperature. All it takes is a degree or two of warming over the normal summertime maximum temperature, and corals get too hot, and in particular the algae inside the corals get too hot, and instead of producing photosynthesis products that they give to the coral, they actually end up producing toxins. And these toxins cause the coral to spit them out, to expel them in a stream of mucus from the polyp's mouth in a process that we call coral bleaching. Coral bleaching causes corals to turn white, as you can see here. And in fact, during a mass coral bleaching episode, you'll see whole reefs that have turned white, like this one. And they actually look rather beautiful. They look sort of like snowfall on a coral reef. But the problem is it doesn't last, and these corals are in a very precarious state. They've lost their symbionts and they can't survive. And so unless conditions return to normal and the temperatures cool down again, corals can only survive in this state for a few weeks or a couple of months before they start to die. And unfortunately, this is the problem that we've been seeing worldwide over the last 30 years with increasingly severe and increasingly prolonged episodes of coral bleaching, which in some places have wiped out 99% of the corals. So for example, in 1997 to 98, we had a big El Nino event. Some of you will probably remember it was on the news, and it caused an accumulation of very warm water in the far western Pacific, really the western Indian Ocean around Kenya, the Seychelles, Mauritius, the Maldives, and all of these island economies suffered huge losses in their coral ecosystems as a result of bleaching. So this is just a single warm water event that killed perhaps 1/6 of the world's coral reefs in just a 9-month period. And obviously climate forecasts predict that we're going to see more and more of these kinds of episodes in the future. And to date, the evidence is bearing that out. We're seeing more episodes of coral bleaching and increasing mortality of corals. So this is just to remind me to say that corals that bleach aren't necessarily dead. As I mentioned to you just now, they can recover. So corals, here's a photo of a coral that I took in Japan that is actually recovering from a coral bleaching event. And it was very interesting to me to see that the way that this coral was recovering appeared to be located around these polyps, and that you can see the pigmentation is sort of centered on those polyps. And I began to wonder how corals can recover from bleaching. Are they recovering from the residual symbionts that are left in the tissues that are rebrowning the coral, or are they actually picking up new symbionts from the environment? And if they're doing that, are they picking up different ones? And I began to get very interested in the idea that maybe coral could respond to changes in the environment by changing the types of algae that they host. Because as I've just mentioned, there's many different types of algae. Maybe when they have a pig, it's no good for the current conditions, and then they bleach, but then maybe the new conditions might help them or might encourage them to pick up or become dominated by an elephant, a type of symbiont that's an elephant. So much of my research at RSMAS has focused on trying to understand the flexibility in this partnership and its constraints. But there's another problem, unfortunately, that coral reefs face, which is also something that we look at the Rosenstiel School, which is the problem of ocean acidification. Now, most people, I think, are probably familiar with the idea of global warming caused by the emission of CO2, which acts as a greenhouse gas and causes the heat from the planet to become trapped under this sort of blanket, and they're causing the planet to warm up. But the emissions of CO2, which is caused by the burning of fossil fuels, actually has another and sort of more insidious problem for the Earth's marine ecosystems. Not only does it cause warming, both for terrestrial and marine ecosystems as a result of the greenhouse effect, but CO2 in the atmosphere also has to equilibrate itself with the ocean. And so much of the CO2 that we emit into the atmosphere actually then dissolves in the ocean. And when you dissolve CO2 in the atmosphere, much as when we dissolve CO2, for example, in a can of Coke to make it carbonated, we actually make that liquid more acidic. Coca-Cola is relatively acidic. This is why they did the whole experiment where you put a baby's tooth in a can of Coke and it dissolves, and you're supposed to show this to your kids as a reason why they shouldn't drink Coke. We actually did this and my kids' teeth didn't dissolve. So anyway, so when you dissolve carbon dioxide in the oceans, they get more acidic. And this is a problem for any organism that tries or is trying to build a skeleton, like corals, as you all have seen, because under acidified conditions, the skeleton grows much more slowly. And we now think it not only grows more slowly, but it also grows more weakly. It's less robust. And so this is a problem for not just corals, it's a problem for shellfish, it's a problem for various commercial interests, especially in Alaska, where it turns out acidification is more of a problem sooner than because of its high latitude. It turns out that ocean acidification is affecting higher latitudes first and then slowly moving down towards the tropics. So coral reefs face a joint problem. They face the problem of CO2 causing warming, which results in bleaching, but they also face the problem of CO2 causing ocean acidification, which makes it more and more difficult for them to build their skeletons. And this is rather a complicated graph, but it basically just shows that as we move from pre-industrial times to the present and to a doubling of CO2, and we predict to have doubled our CO2 from pre-industrial levels by about 2050 or so, 2060, thereabouts. As we move along these lines, the amount of, this is a carbonate iron, those skeletons that I just passed around, those skeletons are made out of calcium carbonate, which is limestone. So it's made of calcium and carbonate that are put together, and the particular kind of calcium carbonate that corals make their skeletons from is called aragonite. And the amount of aragonite, which we call the aragonite saturation state, is actually going down as we move from pre-industrial to a doubling of CO2. And this change from, say, here to there might not seem like a huge amount, but it turns out to be really has an enormous effect on the ability of corals to calcify. So as I write here, climate change impacts reefs because their ability to form this skeleton is hindered. And this is just shows that as we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, what actually happens is the amount of calcium and carbonate that is used to form coral skeletons is less because this carbonate ends up being used in this reaction to form bicarbonate. I won't bore you with the details, but what the net result, as I've mentioned, is that if you plot the aragonite saturation state, the availability of this iron in seawater for corals to build their skeletons, against the calcification rate of corals, then in pre-industrial times, about 1880, corals were calcifying at, sort of for the sake of argument, 100% of their rate. But as we move to 2006, they're down to about 80% of their rate. By 2065, they'll be down to about 60%, and 2100 down to about 50%. So even as we stress coral reefs out by warming them and causing them to bleach, at the same time corals are also facing ocean acidification, and that means that they can't grow quickly enough to recover from bleaching events. And so in fact coral reefs, the ecosystems that are on our doorsteps, are actually probably the world's most sensitive ecosystem from the point of view of climate change. More so than even the Arctic, because they're being hit from both the effects of rising temperatures on the one hand and ocean acidification on the other. And you know, if we want to see the effects of climate change on our planet, we only really have to look right here on our own back doorstep, because we have these ecosystems that are being lost before our very eyes as a result of this. At RSMAS, we do various controlled experiments to try and duplicate the effects of climate change. So a colleague and myself, Chris Langdon, built this climate change lab, we call it, where we essentially duplicate the acidified and warming conditions of the coming century so that we can understand how corals might adapt or respond to these changes, and if there's anything we can do that might accelerate the pace of that adaptation. And this is just to remind me that in addition to running these experiments, you know, I've also had wonderful opportunities to see some of the world's reefs firsthand. Most of my research has involved a certain expeditionary component where we go out, and this gets back to my dreams of a kid reading those books about going out, and I wasn't collecting wildlife for my father's zoo or whatever, but I was collecting DNA samples that sort of look like this. This is a set of 100 samples from Djibouti, and the reefs of Djibouti are very poorly known. In fact, the last scientific expedition to Djibouti was actually by Jacques Cousteau in 1972, and we went back in 2010. And these reefs are really understudied, and so we take samples like this, which is just a tiny fragment of coral preserved in ethanol, which is alcohol. And then from that we can extract the DNA, and in the lab we can analyze the DNA, identify, sort of like DNA fingerprinting, what kind of algae are inside these things. And I became, as I mentioned, very interested in this idea that corals can respond by changing symbionts from one type to another. And I'm going to speed up a little bit. This is just to show you the sort of molecular techniques that we use that show that there are many different types of algae, and you can use DNA sequences to produce these family trees, which are on the left, showing the relationships between all these different types. And we call these different types of algae by these letter names, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and now I. And each one of those groups contains many, many different types of algae. So it's really just this is one family of algae, another family of algae, and another family of algae. They form sort of groups, or clades, as we call them, which is a group of closely related organisms. And some of the early discoveries that we made were exactly as I had sort of hoped, which is that when you survey corals, it turns out that not only do they host a variety of different types of symbiont, but that the distribution of these symbionts is predictable. So if you sample, these are two very common Caribbean corals, Montastria annularis and Montastria faviolata. They call them star corals here. If you sample from the top of the colony, you find that they are loaded with sort of sun-loving types of algae that are on the top of the colony getting a lot of sunlight. But as you move down the side of the colony, they become dominated by completely different types of algae in this group C that are sort of shade tolerant. So just like in a rainforest, you have the upper canopy layer that's adapted to highlight, and the understory layer, which is adapted to low light. Corals are exactly the same. They cover themselves with different types of algae depending on the environment that they see. Highlight on the top, low light on the side. And in fact, if you go down a reef from shallow depths to deep depths, you see that as you get deeper and deeper and deeper, you get more and more of these shade-tolerant algae. So this showed for the first time, back in the 90s, that corals are able to host different types of symbionts, and they can change the kinds of symbionts that they have depending on the environment they see. And so I began to be interested in this idea that maybe corals can do the same thing with heat. In other words, maybe they're a heat-tolerant algae, and maybe they're a cold-tolerant algae. And if there are, maybe there's something we could do in terms of manipulating the symbiosis to encourage more heat-tolerant algae in an era of climate change. So I began this sort of expeditionary research that I just mentioned, going around the world, looking at reefs all over the place. And this is not just my work, but this is other labs in other countries. And we began to build a picture of what the distribution of these different algae was in reef corals around the world. Again, it involved diving, collecting samples, bringing them back to the lab, processing them, and again, diving in some really great places. This is in American Samoa, and this is actually what we think is the world's largest coral. They call them Big Mama. And it's, as I said, it's probably about twice the size of this room, and it consists of something like 200 million polyps, and it's been estimated at being probably 2,100 years old, so it's been around since before the time of Christ. And this coral is so big that, and old, that it even has a cancer. This is a tumor growing, or what we think is a tumor, growing on the side of the coral with sort of a growth deformation caused by the uncontrolled growth of some polyps in this colony. So corals can get old, so old they get cancer too. Here's some more views of the same colony. This is in the Maldives, again one of those world's areas that is very threatened by climate change from the point of view of sea level rise, because they're so low-lying, even more than South Florida. I think the highest point in the Maldives is about 2 feet above sea level. In fact, you can see, it looks like Miami, but that's actually Mali, the capital of the Maldives, on the horizon there, which you can just see. And we began to do experiments both in the lab at the University of Miami, but also in very sort of low-tech conditions out here. This is in the Maldives, where we dig a trench in the beach, fill it with seawater, let the seawater heat up in the sun, and then use that as a natural bleaching experiment. And then we can put the bleached corals out on the reef and see how they recover and where they recover with different types of algae depending on the environment that we put them in. And we can do lots of low-tech. This was the research vessel to transport corals. This is how to do coral research on a shoestring budget. This is a flow meter. This is simply a block of plaster of Paris that has been set in a plastic cup, and then you remove the plastic cup and you can leave these out on the reef, and the rate at which they dissolve is a good measure of how much flow is on it. So the faster the currents, the quicker that dissolves, and the slower the currents, the slower it dissolves, and you can just measure the amount it dissolves by weighing it. So there's lots of fun research you can do if you're that way inclined with a very low budget and access to great reefs and great locations. And you can get more complicated. This is a set of experiments that we ran in American Samoa, where we're actually sort of heating corals up on the beach, running experiments looking at thermotolerance and what the drivers are of thermotolerance. Does a coral that have certain types of algae help it survive bleaching? More gratuitous shots of fun times on the reef. And it's also taken me in unusual directions too. I got interested in the idea that if corals can, let's say, keep pace with climate change or respond to climate change by changing their types of algae that they have, we can address that by doing what I just showed you, going around the world and looking at how corals respond to bleaching events. But we could also, in theory, go backwards in time. And the British Museum, it turns out, has a collection, or I should say the Natural History Museum in London, has a collection of corals that date back anywhere between 30 years and 150 years, and I began to get interested whether we could go back and look at the archived collections of these corals, extract DNA from them and see if we could get usable DNA, 150 years old, from these corals, and see whether there's been a change in the symbionts over this time by sort of going backwards in time using museum collections. So it's been really an interesting opportunity to do research in many different and interesting places. This is in Fiji. In Fiji, it turns out that in order to do any research on the local reefs, reefs in Fiji aren't owned by the government. You don't go to the government to apply for a permit. You go to the local village. The local village has ownership of the reef. And in order to get permission to work there, you get involved in a kava ceremony. Some of you may have done this, where you drink kava, which is a mild sedative and probably has other effects. And you drink this stuff and you explain to the village elders what it is you want to do, and they either give you permission or they don't. But it's been a great way to see how other cultures utilize their reef resources, which reminds me of this, which will be a familiar scene to many of you. This is actually a shell store here in South Florida, which is selling, so she sells seashells on the seashore, which is selling coral skeletons, and it's sort of the curio trade is part of the South Florida culture as well. You know, one only has to go into Monroe County or up in Hollywood and you can see these shell shops all over the place. And you know, as much as I'm attracted by this store, this is the kind of thing that as a kid I would have loved to have gone in. You know, this is the sort of thing that we really have to put a stop to, and we have to put a stop to because unbeknownst to most tourists who go to these stores and buy a souvenir of South Florida, virtually none of any of these organisms actually come from Florida. These are all from the Indo-West Pacific, from the Philippines, from Indonesia, shipped over here in huge containers, and obviously coming from local reefs in Southeast Asia, where they're just taken from the reefs and then put into, dried out on the beach and sent here. And so, you know, one could argue that these are sort of animal ambassadors for us, but really it's something we should probably put a stop to. And in fact, with the listing of Acroporus with the staghorn and elkhorn corals that are now endangered species, on the day that that was listed in 2006, I went with an NBC reporter, some of you might know him, Jeff Burnside, and we did a story of, on the day that these corals were listed under the Endangered Species Act, we went to some of these shell stores and showed that you could actually buy the skeletons of these endangered animals for, I think it was $2,000 off from these shell stores. So it's the equivalent of going to a shop and buying a stuffed rhino foot or a bald eagle or an African elephant. These are all just as protected under the Endangered Species Act as the staghorn and elkhorn corals. And we would never think of buying those things these days, and yet we somehow condone the purchase of coral trinkets. So, okay, I'll just skip through these. So, just to sort of sum up the science side of these things, continued coral bleaching is probably likely in the next few decades with continued climate change and increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. And this CO2 is going to make calcification of corals more difficult as well because the oceans are getting more acidic. And so really what we need to make sure is that reefs are as healthy as they possibly can be in order to survive these changes. There's very little that we can do as a community of people on Key Biscayne about global CO2 emissions. It would be great if we could have an impact, but really I think the focus for myself and those of you who are interested in being citizen scientists is trying to ensure that reefs are as resilient as they can against these threats. And this turns out to be very important because coral reefs are facing not just these climate change stresses, but a whole bunch of much more direct human impacts that corals in South Florida especially see every day that are the direct results of our activities. So human impacts really act in combination to turn rich reefs like this into sort of sad reefs like this, and this is sort of more on where we are in Florida's reefs right now. So the question is how do we get back again? And some of these impacts include nutrient pollution and sedimentation. So I mentioned that coral reefs thrive in areas of the ocean that are nutrient poor, that are the marine equivalent of deserts. If we add nutrients to these waters, it turns out that fertilizes the growth of seaweeds, and seaweeds outpace and smother corals for space on the reef. And it turns out that right here in Florida, we do this on a chronic basis, basically fertilizing the reefs next to us by the addition of nutrients, usually in the form of sewage and in the form of agricultural fertilizers. So that's something that we could do to improve the health of these reefs and help them recover back. Overfishing is a problem that faces coral reefs, and you know this is one of the problems that we're probably all familiar with. But overfishing not only removes the sort of the top parts of the food pyramid, the food web, the top predators, things like the snapper and the grouper, the fish that we really like to eat, but it has knock-on effects throughout the whole food chain, such that on some reefs even we're seeing reductions in fish that actually eat the seaweeds on coral reefs. So if we are adding nutrients to coral reefs, then we're fertilizing the growth of seaweeds, but if we're also causing, through overfishing, the removal of the reef's natural ability to eat this seaweed, we're preventing the reef's ability to sort of crop down these algae, to crop down these seaweeds and help the corals themselves survive. We're also destroying reefs directly, and by that I mean things like port dredging activities, boat groundings, fishing nets, fishing gear trapped up in corals. So really the direct impacts of what we do, often through construction, and that's obviously been an issue that some of you may know about here in Miami, where the Port of Miami, which is actually inside the Biscayne Bay Aquatic Preserve, through the deep dredge operation and the plans to widen and deepen that particular channel to accommodate Super Panamax vessels, this is displacing not just corals but a whole bunch of other marine organisms, and so the question becomes a sort of a cost-benefit analysis. How much do we want to invest in protecting or relocating these corals to accommodate the growth of the port? And you know, this is an ongoing debate and something that we've been involved in terms of, I shouldn't say we, but there have been litigation against the port to make sure that appropriate environmental protections have been taken into account, which is a good thing. And then climate change and disease. I haven't really talked about disease, and I don't want to go into it too much, but diseases have also been implicated in the removal of many of these coral species, especially the staghorn and elkhorn corals that we were passing around. And there's some evidence that climate change is having an impact in the spread of disease. By warming the oceans, it's increasing the spread of this disease and the ability for it to propagate from one colony to another. So as one Roman put it, fortune is not satisfied with inflicting one calamity. We have all of these different things going on at once. I think I'll skip over this. And many of you will be familiar with the pattern of decline on coral reefs, not just from the corals themselves, but those of you sort of long-timers will be familiar with these kinds of pictures from the 1930s there, 1950s here, 1960s and 70s here. These are all trophy pictures from Key West from the same vessel or the same operation going out over decades to the 1970s, to the 1980s, 90s, to today. So this is the average sort of size of fish, what was considered a trophy fish for that day's fishing. And this reflects the fact that we've simply removed most of the large fish on reefs. And as we remove the large groupers and the large long-lived snappers, we just progressively move on down the food web to the next fish that we can get, to the point where this is what's posted as the day's trophy catch, designed to encourage the next set of fishermen to come and use this particular concession. You know, compare that to, you know, this lucky family here. That, look at the size of some of those groupers there, and the abundance. You know, you'd never see groupers like that on the trophy boards these days, at least not in the Florida Keys. Okay, just to sort of tie this up, and then I'll say a few words about the citizen science project. Some of you may have heard, and I've mentioned here, that corals are being considered for listing on the Endangered Species Act. And in 2006, 2 species were listed as threatened, which is sort of the lowest grade of threat under the Endangered Species Act. And this was a result of, you know, a lot of work showing that elkhorn and staghorn corals used to be abundant in shallow water reef ecosystems throughout the Caribbean and in the Florida Keys. But they've basically vanished. The declines have been about 97 to 99%, depending on different parts of the world. So these corals have vanished from most Caribbean reefs, and you know, with the introduction of the Endangered Species Act as it's applied to corals, that drove a lot of positive change, actually. So there's been a lot of efforts in the last 5 years to farm corals, to create nurseries of corals that can be used to propagate and then plant out to reefs to help them restore. And this is work done by an organization in Key Largo, but we also have nurseries at RSMAS run by Diego Learman, who's the other scientist involved with this citizen science project. And he's going to be talking about this in December, about his efforts to grow out these corals and use them to reseed reefs. But the situation for corals has become so bad that now the federal government is actually considering adding another 66 species to the endangered species list. And furthermore, in addition to adding 66 species, they're going to change the threat level of the 2 species that they just listed 7 years ago as threatened and upgrading them to endangered. So, you know, unfortunately, it seems these corals are continuing to decline, and really now is the time for us to act, because if we lose corals from reefs, it's a bit like losing the trees in a rainforest. You know, you can't really imagine a rainforest without the trees, and you can't really have a reef ecosystem without the corals. They're the things that ultimately build the ecosystem and create the habitat upon which all these other organisms depend. So the time is really now. So why do we need to list corals under the Endangered Species Act, you might ask? We know that there's going to be more coral bleaching over the next few years and decades, and we know that there's going to be more calcification. So again, we need reefs to be as healthy as possible. So we need strong legislation that will actually prevent the direct take, for example, of corals from reefs, or that will actually hinder federal activities to damage reefs directly. And so there is value to this kind of legislation, and it's one of the few tools that we really have in our toolbox to really speak from the point of view of the corals, because, you know, from my perspective, as I see these activities over the 15 or 20 years that I've worked on reefs, it's always too easy for local actions to take precedent, usually for economic reasons, over a particular coral reef. When one particular coral reef, all sort of by itself, has to argue for its own survival against an economic activity that's likely to threaten its future health, inevitably the economics win. And it's only if we sort of take the full picture and say, if we allow every single one of those battles to be lost, then sooner or later we'll have no reefs. We have to recognize that together these reefs really need to have a voice, and if there's going to be a voice, it has to take the shape of some form of legislation. Okay, so what can be done to reverse the decline? Well, we should be thinking about making meaningful changes to how we manage water quality in large metropolitan areas close to coral reefs like here. And obviously, you know, on an everyday basis, this is obviously usually low on our list of priorities, but unless we really improve the water quality around us, it's hard to prevent the further declines in these reef ecosystems, which should be trying to reduce the impacts of overfishing. Unfortunately, you know, you should think twice about the types of fish and the abundance of fish that you eat, especially if it comes from local reefs. Think about where you're eating on the fish food chain. It's much better for the marine environment to feed on fish that are low down on the food chain. And these aren't reef fish, but they're good examples. Things like anchovies and sardines are far better for the marine environment than grouper, snapper, tuna, that if you think about it, are actually the marine equivalent of lions, tigers, and bears. They're the top predators on a reef, the things that are at the top of the food chain. Nothing eats them. They are the top predators, other than us. And we would never consider eating lions, tigers, and bears. So if we can just think that tuna equals tiger, then, you know, just as tigers are low in abundance worldwide, so unfortunately are tuna. And if we can go for lower items on the food chain, they're so much more abundant and they're just as nutritious that it's a good idea for the environment. The Endangered Species Act is probably an effective way to help us reduce these kinds of impacts. This will help enhance the resilience of reefs. So I'll tie it up there and just say a few quick words about the Citizen Science Project. So, you know, I got involved with Melissa and with Diego and Bob and to start this program because, you know, even though you have one of the world's premier marine research institutions right here on Virginia Key, we didn't feel that we interact enough with you as a community here who are presumably just as vested in these resources as we are. And we also realized that there was really no monitoring going on of these local ecosystems close to Key Biscayne because most of the focus interests was further south in the Florida Keys proper. And this came to the fore during the recent sort of deep dredge activities where people became concerned, residents of the Key became concerned that the activities, the blasting and the dredging and the sediment plume from this activity might affect your local water quality and might affect the seagrasses and the other resources that you have here. But unfortunately, nobody had any information on what the resources were from here. There were no maps, there was no coverage data, and in fact, the only data that we have on the status of these resources comes from the Army Corps of Engineers. And the Army Corps of Engineers are the people who are actually in charge of the blasting and the dredging. So it's a bit like having what's the chickens in the hen house? The fox watching the hens, thank you. We really need an independent source of information that's free from those sorts of conflicts of interest. And this seemed like a great opportunity to engage local citizens to be part of that effort because it needs eyes in the water. It needs bodies on the ground and you know, boots on the ground, to take a common, a recent analogy, and to try and to get more people involved in the process of data collection. So, without saying any more, I think I've spoken long enough. The idea, obviously, we can't just throw you in the water and say, tell us what you see. We need to train you guys so that you know what you're seeing and you can report it accurately. And so we've arranged, and we're just starting a series of training workshops focused on different ecosystems, mangroves, seagrasses, and coral reefs. And these are going to be held, I think, at the community center or at RSMAS. Okay, so location to be determined, but in the next month or so, and it's your chance to get involved, to learn this stuff, and help us collect the data that will help you protect these resources. So I'm going to hand it over to Audra, but first, are there any questions on anything that? Yeah, sorry, I completely forgot to mention, there was a sort of a conversation, but some of the most exciting, extract the algae and then you can grow them in culture and then actually reintroduce those algae to other corals. And the idea is that if we could give corals a sort of a seed stock of these heat-resistant algae, it might help them survive future bleaching events. Obviously, it's a big step to go from an experiment in the lab that shows that you can do this to trying to protect reefs. But actually, I think it helps inform us on the kinds of mechanisms that might be at play that might help reefs have a fighting chance of adapting to climate change. They just need a little bit to get started. and the chance for these algae to accumulate in coral tissues. So I think a lot of the research that I've been doing has a sort of an optimistic bent, that it shows that there is possibilities for corals to adapt. So of course, if they've got a chance to adapt, we need to make sure that they have the opportunity to adapt by not just saying, well, we've lost coral reefs, let's turn our attention to another ecosystem that we can save. No, we really need to do everything we can to ensure that corals are in the healthiest environment they can, so they have this chance to adapt.
And my question is essentially the same, but picking up on it. So you talked about doing that preventatively before the bleaching occurs, trying to change the algae that are already there. Have you also worked on reefs that have just sustained a bleaching event and tried to inoculate them, and does that work?
Yeah, so we haven't done that in the field yet, but we have done that in the lab, and actually this is a bleached coral is like an open blank canvas. It's actually much easier to get an inoculated alga into a bleached coral than it is into a healthy coral. So we've actually discovered if we want to get algae into a coral, it's better to actually mildly bleach them first. Give them a little bit of heat stress that causes them to lose, say, half their algae, and then introduce a sort of another spike of different algae, and that helps them pick it up. But this is very much brand new research that we're very excited about. But as I said, it's, you know, the last thing I'm going to get you guys to do is suit up with syringes full of algae and go out on local reefs and pump them full of heat-tolerant algae. But I think it does inform how reefs are going to respond in the future, and potentially the kinds of things that we might consider doing on a limited basis. Yeah.
So the elkhorn and the staghorn, which are endangered, does that mean that the algae that was, I mean, I guess the algae determines what the shape the coral takes, is that correct?
Not really. The shape of the coral is driven by the host species, the coral species itself. But it's something that I've been wondering myself, is that there does seem to be an effect of algae, that algae may have an effect that as yet undescribed on the way that corals calcify that might impact their growth. But generally speaking, no, all those different growth shapes are not driven by algal type. And by the way, neither is the color. All of the colors that you see on coral reefs, it's tempting to think that that must come because of all of the different types of algae. But in fact, most of those color pigments are from the coral animal itself. And it's just really a coincidence that when corals bleach and lose their algae, all those coral pigments are also broken down, resulting in usually white corals. Because coral bleaching causes corals to turn white, it's tempting to think that all of the coloration is from the algae, but in fact the algae just are responsible for a certain yellowish brown hue that all corals have. All the other subsidiary colors come from corals. Yeah? Can you? Graft. You can, actually that's interesting, because this is something else that we've just been doing in the lab, where you can graft a coral to another part of the same coral. So for example, you certainly can't take two corals of different species and graft them together. They'll fight one another. And you can't even take usually two different colonies of the same species and graft them. They'll still fight, you know. But you can take, because corals are colonial organisms, you can chop them in half and they'll grow independently, just like you can take a lawn and divide it into squares and then sell the squares of lawn and people can grow their own lawn. You can do the same thing with a coral, and we use that property a lot in our experiments. Actually, we fragment them to create little units. So you can use those units to regraft them back onto each other. If one coral is sort of sick or dying, one of your pieces, you could actually graft a healthy piece onto it and look to see what happens. And that's something we're actually doing in the lab, but it's not something that people commonly do. It's not like in gardening where this is commonly undertaken. Yes, young man, strangely familiar. What will happen to the corals in 2200? That's a very interesting question. So many people look at the projections of climate change and say, well, by 2200, we're going to have so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the planet's going to be so warm, and the oceans are going to be so acidic that there's simply no way that coral reefs can survive that kind of change. And even though there's an inescapable logic to that argument, I don't know, I have some optimism that in your lifetime, if not in mine, we'll be able to change the way we use the planet so that we don't make it so bad for life on this planet, that it doesn't get so hot and it doesn't get so acidified. So first of all, we can try and change what we're doing to the planet, but I also think that corals have mechanisms of adaptation that we're still learning about that might help them deal with some of these changes. So the short answer is I don't know. Any more questions? Okay, I'm going to pass you to Audra, and who's going to tell you about upcoming workshop opportunities. And thank you for coming. Apologies for the confusion about start time, but thanks for coming.
What to expect in the field, and why what we're looking at is important. So I have a couple of workshops, one on seagrasses and one on mangroves, and mangroves will be first, probably 2 or 3 weeks. And I need volunteers to come in for about an hour and listen to me talk about mangroves. So if you guys are interested in learning more about mangroves and the 3 local species and one of the mangrove associates, you're more than welcome to join us. And if you want to give me your email address, I can contact you directly. There will also be information on the Facebook page and the Citizen Science website. So, yes. So, and hopefully next year we'll be able to get you guys actually out in the field and doing this, working side by side with RSMAS scientists. So that's the goal.
Okay, the website is keyscience.org. Keyscience.org.
Yes. Does anyone have any questions for me?